I chose a weekend in the rainy season, hoping to witness the forest in its lushest, most vibrant state. The journey to the forest was long and arduous, with the rain steadily increasing as I drove deeper into the wilderness. The road was winding and narrow, barely more than a dirt path, which only heightened the sense of adventure. By the time I arrived and set up camp, near a babbling brook, the rain had transformed the landscape into a misty, ethereal wonderland. The air was cool, and the smell of wet earth and pine filled my lungs. I felt a sense of peace, as if I had stepped into another world, far removed from the chaos of civilization. The first day was idyllic. I spent hours exploring the surroundings, marveling at the towering trees, the moss-covered rocks, and the myriad of life forms that thrived in this secluded haven. As dusk approached, I returned to my campsite, feeling content and at ease. I built a fire, the warmth and light a comforting presence as the night settled in. The forest was alive with sounds, the croaking of frogs, the rustling of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl. It was a symphony of life, soothing and familiar. However, my peace was shattered in the middle of the night. I awoke suddenly, my heart racing. With an inexplicable sense of dread, the fire had burned low, casting eerie shadows that danced around my tent. I listened, straining to hear what had disturbed my sleep, but all was silent save for the gentle patter of rain on the leaves. Just as I was about to dismiss it as a bad dream, I saw it, a flickering light in the distance, barely visible through the thick foliage. Curiosity, tinged with an uneasy feeling, compelled me to investigate. I grabbed my flashlight and cautiously made my way toward the light, each step slow and deliberate. The rain had turned the forest floor into a slick, muddy mess, making the trek difficult. The light grew brighter as I approached, revealing a large clearing I hadn't noticed before. In the center stood a roaring bonfire, its flames licking the night sky, casting an unnatural glow on the scene. Around the fire, a group of people stood in a circle, dressed in dark, hooded robes. Their faces were obscured, and they moved in an unsettling, synchronized manner, chanting in a low, guttural tone that sent chills down my spine. It was a language I didn't recognize, harsh and discordant, unlike anything I'd ever heard. My heart pounded in my chest, a primal fear gripping me as I realized I was witnessing something far beyond my comprehension. As if sensing my presence, one of the figures turned and locked eyes with me. In that moment, the chanting ceased, and the rest of the group turned to face me. I was paralyzed with fear, my flashlight slipping from my grasp and clattering to the ground. The leader, an imposing figure with eyes that glinted with malice, stepped forward. His voice, cold and devoid of emotion, cut through the silence. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his words sending a jolt of terror through me. Panic surged within me, and I turned to flee, but the muddy ground betrayed me. I slipped and fell, the impact knocking the wind out of me. Before I could scramble to my feet, they were upon me. Rough hands grabbed me, dragging me toward the fire. I struggled, but it was futile. They were too many, and their grip was ironclad. My mind raced, a flurry of thoughts and fears crashing through my consciousness. Who were these people? What were they doing? And what did they want with me? They threw me to the ground near the fire, the heat intense against my skin. The leader approached, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "You've seen too much," he said, his voice dripping with menace. The others resumed their chanting, louder and more fervent this time. The air seemed to thicken, a palpable tension building, pressing down on me like an invisible weight. I watched in horror as they began to draw symbols in the dirt around the fire, intricate and unfamiliar, their meanings a dark mystery. They chanted a name repeatedly, Belial. The name sent a shiver down my spine. I had heard it before, in stories and legends, a name synonymous with evil and demonic forces. My fear escalated into pure terror as I realized they were summoning something dark and malevolent. The flames of the fire leapt higher, casting grotesque shadows that seemed to dance and twist. The air grew cold, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones, chilling you from the inside out. Then, from the heart of the fire, a figure began to emerge. It was a demon, towering and menacing, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. The sight of it filled me with a primal fear, a deep, visceral terror that made my skin crawl and my heart race. The cultist's chants reached a fever pitch, directing the demon's attention toward me. It turned its gaze upon me, its eyes boring into my soul, and I felt a wave of nausea and dread. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body was frozen in place, paralyzed by fear. The demons stepped closer, and the cultists moved to block any escape routes, their faces twisted into expressions of zeal and anticipation. Just as the demon reached for me, something snapped within me. A surge of adrenaline coursed through my veins, breaking the paralysis that had gripped me. With a desperate burst of strength, I lunged to the side, narrowly avoiding the demon's grasp. The cultists shouted in anger and surprise, their chants faltering. I seized the moment, scrambling to my feet and bolting toward the darkness of the forest. The forest, once a place of peace and solace, had transformed into a nightmarish labyrinth. The trees loomed like twisted sentinels, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The rain-soaked ground was treacherous, each step a struggle against the mud that threatened to pull me down. Behind me, I could hear the demon's guttural growls, closer with each passing second. The cultist voices echoed through the trees, urging the demon to pursue me. My lungs burned, my legs felt like lead, but I pushed on, driven by sheer terror. The forest seemed endless, the darkness all-consuming. I stumbled over roots, slipped on rocks, the pain of each fall barely registering against the overwhelming fear. My only thought was to escape, to put as much distance between myself and the demon as possible. After what felt like an eternity, I emerged from the forest, bursting onto a deserted road. I collapsed onto the wet asphalt, gasping for breath, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. The rain poured down in sheets, mingling with the tears that streamed down my face. I lay there, too drained to move, listening for any sign of pursuit. A faint light appeared in the distance, growing brighter as it approached. It was a car, the first sign of civilization I had seen in hours. The vehicle slowed as it neared, and the driver, a middle-aged man with a kind face, stepped out. His expression shifted from confusion to concern as he saw me lying there, battered and bleeding. He rushed to my side, helping me to my feet. "Are you all right? What happened?" he asked, his voice filled with genuine worry. I tried to speak, but the words caught in my throat, my mind still reeling from the night's events. Seeing my distress, he led me to his car and drove me to the nearest hospital. The journey was a blur, my mind replaying the horrifying scenes over and over. At the hospital, doctors and nurses rushed to my aid, their faces a mixture of shock and pity. I was barely conscious, my body in shock, my mind struggling to process what had happened. They treated my injuries, bruises, cuts, and the deep gash on my arm, but it was too late to save my hand. The demon's touch had caused irreversible damage, and they had to amputate it to save my life. As I lay in the hospital bed, groggy from the pain medication, a detective came to take my statement. I recounted the events as best as I could, my voice shaking with the effort. He listened intently, but I could see the skepticism in his eyes. When I finished, he promised to investigate, though his tone suggested he didn't believe a word of it. Days passed, and the police found no evidence of the cult or the demon. The clearing was empty, the fire pit cold and undisturbed. They chalked it up to a traumatic experience, suggesting I might have hallucinated the entire ordeal. But I knew what I had seen, what I had felt. The fear, the cold, the demon's touch. They were real, too real to dismiss as mere fantasy. The doctors said I was lucky to be alive, but I didn't feel lucky. I felt haunted, a deep sense of dread settling in my bones. Every time I looked at the stump where my hand used to be, I was reminded of that night, of the darkness that exists just beyond the edge of the known world. My love for the outdoors was tainted, replaced by a pervasive fear that the darkness might come for me again. I haven't been camping since, and I doubt I ever will. Some nights, I wake up in a cold sweat, my heart racing, the memory of the demon's eyes burning in my mind. I hear the cultists' chants, feel the demon's icy grip, and I'm transported back to that clearing, back to the nightmare. I've come to accept that some things can't be explained, that some horrors are real, and they lurk in the shadows, waiting for the unwary. This experience has left me scarred, both physically and emotionally, but it also taught me a valuable lesson. Never underestimate the darkness, for it is deeper and more terrifying than we can imagine. And sometimes the monsters are real, waiting in the dark corners of the world, ready to strike when we least expect it.
The forest had always been a place of solace for me, a refuge from the chaos of daily life. I loved the feeling of being surrounded by towering trees, the scent of pine needles underfoot, and the distant calls of wildlife. But even in my love for the wilderness, I knew there were places best left unexplored, stories told in hushed tones around campfires. This trip, however, I decided to venture into a part of the woods that was seldom talked about, a place known as Whispering Pines. Whispering Pines was a small, dense forest nestled at the base of a mountain range. Local legends spoke of strange happenings there, voices in the night, people disappearing without a trace, and an unsettling presence that lingered in the air. Most locals avoided it, but my curiosity got the better of me. I wanted to experience the mystery firsthand, to see if the tales held any truth. I set out on a crisp autumn morning, the air cool and the leaves just beginning to turn. The trail was faint, barely used, and as I ventured deeper, the forest grew darker and more oppressive. The canopy above was thick, allowing only slivers of sunlight to penetrate, casting eerie shadows on the forest floor. The deeper I went, the quieter it became, the usual sounds of the forest fading into an unsettling silence. By late afternoon, I found a small clearing to set up camp. It was an ideal spot, sheltered and relatively flat, with a small stream nearby. I pitched my tent and gathered wood for a fire, all the while feeling a slight unease, as if I were being watched. I brushed it off as my imagination playing tricks on me, influenced by the stories I had heard. As night fell, the temperature dropped and I huddled by the fire, warming my hands. The silence was thick, almost tangible, broken only by the occasional crackle of the fire. Then, faintly at first, I heard it, a whisper, so soft it could have been the wind. I looked around but saw nothing. The whispers continued, growing clearer, though the words were indecipherable. I told myself it was just the wind rustling through the trees, but a nagging feeling of dread settled in my chest. The whispers seemed to surround me, circling the clearing. I strained my ears, trying to catch any distinct words, but they remained just out of reach, a haunting murmur that set my nerves on edge. Unable to shake the feeling of being watched, I decided to turn in for the night. I climbed into my tent, zipped it up, and lay down, listening to the whispers. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, growing louder as the night deepened. My mind raced, recalling the stories of Whispering Pines, tales of restless spirits and vengeful entities. I tried to sleep, but the whispers were relentless, gnawing at my sanity. Sometime in the early hours, I must have drifted off, for I awoke suddenly to an eerie silence. The whispers had stopped, and the forest was deathly quiet. I felt a chill in the air, an unnatural cold that seeped into my bones. I sat up, heart pounding, and reached for my flashlight. As I turned it on, the beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing something that made my blood run cold. There, just outside the tent, were footprints. They circled my campsite, leading in and out of the clearing, but they weren't ordinary footprints. They were elongated, twisted with long, claw-like impressions at the ends. I froze, the beam of light trembling in my hand. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I wasn't alone. The whispers started again, louder this time, clearer. They were inside my head, an endless cacophony of voices, overlapping and chaotic. I clutched my head, trying to shut them out, but they only grew louder, more insistent. The words began to make sense, though I wished they hadn't. "Leave, intruder. This place is not for you." Panic surged through me. I had to get out, but my legs felt like lead, my body numb with fear. Gathering all the strength I could muster, I forced myself out of the tent. The whispers turned to angry shouts, the voices overlapping in a terrifying chorus. I grabbed my backpack, barely stopping to gather my things, and stumbled into the darkness. The forest, once familiar and inviting, was now a maze of shadows and unseen threats. The whispers followed me, echoing in my mind, urging me to leave, threatening dire consequences if I stayed. I stumbled over roots, branches snagged my clothes, and the cold seemed to penetrate deeper with each step. As I ran, the trees seemed to close in, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The path I'd taken into the forest was gone, replaced by a tangle of underbrush and shadows. I was lost, disoriented with no sense of direction. The whispers became taunting, mocking my panic and confusion. In a desperate bid for freedom, I broke into a clearing, hoping to find a way out. But instead, I was met with a sight that made my heart stop. There, in the center of the clearing, was an old, decrepit cabin. It looked abandoned, the wood rotting and the windows dark and empty. The whispers grew louder, converging on the cabin, beckoning me closer. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, but something compelled me to move forward. As I approached, the whispers changed, becoming more urgent, almost pleading. I reached the door, which hung loosely on its hinges, and pushed it open. The air inside was cold and stale, filled with the scent of decay. The interior was dark, lit only by the faint glow of my flashlight. The walls were lined with strange symbols, crudely carved into the wood, and the floor was covered in dust and debris. In the center of the room stood a crude altar, upon which lay an ancient weathered book. The whispers seemed to emanate from the book, their intensity rising to a fever pitch. Against my better judgment, I reached for the book. As my fingers touched the cover, a shock ran through me and the whispers stopped. The silence was deafening, a void that seemed to swallow all sound. I opened the book, the pages brittle and yellowed with age. The text was in a language I couldn't read, but the symbols matched those on the walls. As I flipped through the pages, a sense of dread filled me. This was a place of dark rituals, a nexus of malevolent energy. The air grew colder, and I felt a presence in the room, something ancient and powerful. The whispers returned, but this time they were different, clear, demanding, and filled with anger. "Begone! You have trespassed on sacred ground. Leave or suffer the consequences." I slammed the book shut and backed away, my heart racing. The presence seemed to press in on me, suffocating and oppressive. I turned and fled from the cabin, bursting into the night air, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't stop running until I was far from the clearing, the whispers fading into the distance. Eventually, I found my way back to the trail and out of whispering pines. I never looked back, not wanting to see if anything followed me. I drove straight home, my mind reeling from the night's events. The whispers still echoed in my ears, a haunting reminder of the horrors I had encountered. To this day, I don't know what I encountered in that forest. I never went back, and I've never told anyone the full story, fearing they wouldn't believe me or that speaking of it would somehow summon it back. But I know one thing for sure. There are places in this world best left undisturbed, where the line between reality and the supernatural blurs, and where the whispers in the woods are more than just the wind. We were young and restless, eager for adventure and the thrill of the unknown. Our group consisted of me, Sarah, the ever-curious explorer, Tom, the skeptical one who dismissed ghost stories as nonsense, Jenny, the gentle spirit who always sought harmony with nature, Alex, the practical joker with a penchant for scaring others, and Lisa, our voice of reason, who often kept our more reckless tendencies in check. The plan was simple, a weekend camping trip deep in the forest, far from the well-trodden paths. We had heard stories of an abandoned campsite, a place shrouded in mystery and rumors of hauntings. It was said that years ago a group of campers had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only a few scattered belongings and a chilling sense of unease. The locals avoided the area, claiming it was cursed, but we dismissed these tales as mere superstition. Armed with our camping gear and an insatiable curiosity, we set out early on a Friday morning. The hike to the campsite was long and arduous, the dense canopy overhead casting everything in a dim, greenish hue. As we trekked deeper into the forest, the air grew cooler, and the sounds of wildlife seemed to fade, replaced by an eerie silence. Finally, after hours of hiking, we arrived at the abandoned campsite. It was a desolate clearing surrounded by tall, ancient trees that seemed to lean inward as if to protect some dark secret. The remnants of old tents, now mere scraps of fabric, and a crumbling stone fire pit were all that remained of the previous occupants. The sight sent a shiver down my spine, but I brushed it off, attributing it to the cold air. We set up our tents and gathered wood for a fire, eager to shake off the chill and relax after the long journey. As night fell, the fire's warm glow cast long shadows, and we sat around it, sharing stories and laughing, the dark tales of the campsite momentarily forgotten. But as the evening wore on, an unsettling feeling began to creep in, an inexplicable sense of being watched. It was Jenny who first noticed it. She had always been sensitive to the moods of places and people, and tonight, she was visibly uneasy. "Does anyone else feel that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's like we're not alone." Tom scoffed, shaking his head. "Come on, Jen. It's just the wind and the dark playing tricks on you. There's nothing out here but us and some old ghost stories." But as if to challenge his skepticism, the fire suddenly flickered, the flames dancing wildly as a gust of wind swept through the clearing. The temperature seemed to drop, and the shadows around us deepened, growing darker and more oppressive. A strange, faint sound reached our ears, a distant whisper that seemed to come from all directions at once. We looked at each other, unease settling in our stomachs. Alex, ever the prankster, tried to lighten the mood with a joke, but even his voice carried a hint of tension. "Maybe it's the ghosts of the lost campers, coming to join us for s'mores." His words hung in the air, and for a moment, we all felt the weight of the stories we had laughed off. Despite our nervous laughter, the sense of foreboding grew. As the night wore on, the whispers became clearer, more insistent, like voices just out of earshot, speaking in a language we couldn't understand. Feeling the weight of our surroundings, we decided to turn in for the night, each of us retreating to the fragile comfort of our tents. But sleep did not come easily. The forest seemed alive with unseen eyes, and the whispers persisted, growing louder and more distinct. They were not the rustling of leaves or the creaking of branches, but voices echoing in the darkness. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring at the tent's ceiling, trying to convince myself it was all in my head. But the whispers grew clearer, almost as if they were right beside me. Straining to hear, I could make out fragmented words, names, cries for help. My heart pounded in my chest, fear clawing at my throat. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream pierced the night, followed by the sound of frantic rustling. I bolted upright, adrenaline surging through me, as I heard the others stirring in their tents. We rushed outside, flashlights in hand, the beams slicing through the oppressive darkness. The source of the scream was Jenny. She stood at the edge of the clearing, her face pale and eyes wide with terror, pointing into the forest. "I saw someone," she gasped, her voice trembling. "There was a woman. She was standing right there, staring at me." We directed our flashlights towards the spot she indicated, but there was nothing, only the impenetrable darkness of the forest. Tom, trying to calm everyone, approached Jenny, but she recoiled, her fear palpable. "It wasn't just a shadow," she insisted. "She looked real." But she wasn't. Her eyes, they were empty, like she was lost. A chill ran down my spine at her words. We decided to stay together by the fire, abandoning the idea of sleep. The atmosphere was thick with tension, each of us straining to hear beyond the crackling of the fire and the whispers that seemed to encircle us. As the night deepened, the voices grew louder, more desperate. They spoke of the lost, of wandering souls unable to find peace. Each voice was distinct, a chorus of anguish and despair. We huddled closer together, our fear growing with each passing minute. Suddenly, Alex, who had been silent and staring into the darkness, stood up abruptly. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his voice low and intense. "It's like they're calling for us." Before we could react, he began walking towards the forest, his movements stiff and unnatural. We called after him, panic rising, but it was as if he couldn't hear us. Tom and I rushed to grab him, pulling him back to the fire. "What's gotten into you?" Tom demanded, shaking Alex. Alex blinked as if coming out of a trance. I don't know," he stammered. "It felt like someone was pulling me, like I had to follow the voices." We exchanged worried glances, the reality of our situation sinking in. The whispers were not just eerie noises, they were beckoning us, trying to lure us deeper into the forest. The air was thick with a palpable sense of malevolence, as if the very ground we stood on was cursed. Desperation set in as we realized we couldn't stay here, but the thought of leaving the campsite and venturing into the dark forest was equally terrifying. We were trapped, caught between the danger we could see and the unknown terror lurking in the shadows. As dawn approached, the voices intensified, their pleas turning to cries of anger and sorrow. It was then that Lisa, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. I think they're the lost campers," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're trapped here, unable to move on." The realization hit us like a cold wave. The stories of the lost campers were true, but they were not just lost. They were restless spirits, bound to this place, seeking to draw others into their eternal night. Determined to survive, we decided to leave at first light, hoping the morning sun would dispel the darkness that clung to the forest. We packed up quickly, the oppressive feeling lifting slightly as the first rays of dawn broke through the trees. As we hiked back, the forest seemed to release its hold on us, the whispers fading with each step. But the memory of those voices and the faces we thought we saw in the shadows stayed with us. We emerged from the forest, shaken and exhausted, grateful to be alive. We never spoke of what happened that night, not even among ourselves. The experience was too surreal, too terrifying to fully comprehend. We all felt a deep sense of loss, not just for the night of terror we endured, but for the souls we left behind, forever bound to that cursed place. Years have passed and we've moved on with our lives. But sometimes in the quiet moments, I still hear those whispers, faint and distant. They are a reminder of a night we cannot forget, of a place where the boundary between the living and the dead is thin, and where the lost are forever searching for a way home. We never returned to that forest, and we warned others to stay away. Whether they heeded our warning or not, we never knew. But we could only hope that no one else would be drawn to the voices in the dark, to the lost campers who still wander, calling out for help that will never come.